not consistent with a gravitational collapse. 90,000 tons of concrete destroyed, pulverized to 100 microns. So what about that evidence that we were talking about in the debris? Wouldn't we expect evidence of explosives? Well, let's start with this unique phenomenon. A molten metal pouring out of the South Tower, in fact, 10 minutes prior to its collapse, golden yellow. That implies that it is not aluminum just by its very color. In fact, here's what aluminum looks like when it's molten. It doesn't glow in bright daylight conditions. It's silvery. Interesting. Who else saw molten metal? Well, as of 21 days after the attack, the fires were still burning and molten metal was still running. It says Leslie Robertson, as he is quoted saying this in a structural engineering conference. And his associate, Richard Garlock, saw the same thing and said, the debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running. They couldn't stop talking about this molten metal because none of them had ever seen it or heard about it in fires before. This urban search and rescue worker says fires burned and molten metal flowed. And this structural engineer, red hot steel being pulled from deep within the pile. And the contractors, Peter Tully, president of the site cleanup, saw lit pools of literally molten steel. What is this stuff? Dripping from the molten steel. Steel flowed in molten streams. Seeing the molten steel. Uncovering red-hot metal beams. Molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains. Abulhazan Astani from UC Berkeley documents the melting of girders. And FEMA documents the melting of girders, causing it to look like Swiss cheese. Intergranular melting, documented at FEMA's Building Performance Assessment Report, May of 2002, turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese. They document the rapid oxidation and sulfidation. The concrete melted around the guns of at the police museum, it's now in the police museum. Concrete doesn't melt until about 3,000 degrees. Where are the temperatures coming from? Still cherry red, these pieces of steel, and these. What happens to that molten metal after it cools?
One of the more unusual artifacts to emerge from the rubble is this rock-like object that has come to be known as the meteorite.
It's this fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat. And architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
Steel doesn't rust. Aluminum doesn't rust, and yet these meteorites, as they call them, were rusting. You can watch the 2-hour DVD and see John Gross of NIST, lead co-project investigator, lying through his teeth because there is documented evidence of molten metal. Problem is the fires don't create temperatures associated with melting steel or iron. 1,200 degree fires, according to Eiger, steel doesn't melt till about 2,700 degrees. It doesn't start dripping till well after that. What are we talking about here? We have a problem. Is there chemical evidence of cutter charges? Could thermite have cut all that steel? Well, thermite creates molten iron as its byproduct. It's an incendiary designed to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. I encourage you to look at our DVD to learn more about thermite. It's available in the back. Dr. Jones conducts testing on the previously molten metal. He finds that it's not aluminum, it's not melted steel, in fact it's iron. Iron, again, the byproduct of thermite. But is there any evidence in the dust of thermite? They pull up on the magnets, USGS, in their studies, find these spheres, billions of them in every sampling, throughout all of the samples. In fact, it's so ubiquitous that they say it's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has these spheres. R.J. Lee, doing toxicological studies on the dust on top of Deutsche Bank building, finds the same spheres. They're iron. It's not melted steel, once again. It's iron. Where did it come from? They don't know, and they're not saying. Okay? It's a mystery. It's a huge mystery. the spheres occupy about 6% of the volume of this dust on top of the Deutsche Bank building. This is a huge percentage of this dust. This is not background stuff. And so Dr. Jones also looks at the spheres, and he determines that, hey, these have the same chemical makeup, in addition to the iron, as known spheres that are produced from thermite demonstration that he did. So he concludes that this is significant evidence for aluminothermic reactions, and he goes and looks in the dust. And so he has 4 dust samples, and he puts the magnet to them, and not only do the spheres come up, but these curious red-gray chips, red on one side, gray on the other. All the samples, hundreds of these chips. Fascinating. So he looks at it very carefully and determines that they also have the similar ingredients to unignited thermite, aluminum, silica, iron, oxygen. And so he zooms in on this red layer 50,000 times, and he finds rhomboidal, 40 nanometers across, rhomboidal-shaped iron oxide particles, and 500 nanometers across aluminum plate-like structures. This is the makeup of thermite. These are so perfectly uniform to each other, and in the perfect percentage to each other to make up thermite. 25% aluminum, 75% iron, set in an organic matrix of silica. That gives you the gas pressure work. It turns a thermite into an explosive. Why do they make this stuff so small? Because when you ignite it, its surface area is so huge that it becomes very explosive. In fact, they put this stuff in a heater, Dr. Jones does, and at about 400 degrees it explodes. Paint doesn't do that. Paint is not made of nanoparticles. It doesn't have the percentages, doesn't have the constituents. And the spheres that are created when you put those in the heater are the same chemical makeup as the spheres that are pulled out of the samples in the World Trade Center dust. There's no difference. This is a case-closed issue. Okay, and you just got it in, 3 minutes. The spheres are associated with the partially ignited chips. There's just no way around this evidence. It's documented in Lawrence Livermore Lab prior to 9/11, 2001. They say it can be very, very powerful stuff. They call it super thermite. It's not made in a cave in Afghanistan. It's made only in the most sophisticated Defense Department contracting laboratories. Kind of like that anthrax that was used, by the way. I didn't say that. It's also documented in a 25-page peer-reviewed paper that you can download and give to your friends and say, hey, this is not dealt with. It stood uncontested for the last year. Uncontested in the peer-reviewed world. So we have several tons of molten iron found in pools in the debris pile with a fingerprint of incendiary thermite, numerous melted steel beams, but we don't have temperatures in the fires that can do that. We have molten iron microspheres that take over 3,000 degrees to create, and we have red-gray chips of unexploded nanothermite, which shouldn't have been found in the World Trade Center dust. Which hypothesis is supported? Is it the fire hypothesis, or is it the explosives? I'll leave that with you. We've shown direct evidence of explosive destruction, fire not being able to account for any one of these. And we've got the NIST report, which comes along and says, hey, we analyzed this. We spent $20 million in 3 years. And they were supposed to tell us how these buildings collapsed. Here's the problem. They stopped at the initiation of collapse. This is one of many problems. Why would you stop just at the point where the first truss was pulling in that column and then stop and not analyze the structural capability of the structure below to withstand this falling mass? That's not difficult. I mean, not if you have 3 years and $20 million anyway. They had to stop because at that point, after that point is where all the evidence of explosive controlled demolition begins to show itself. They couldn't go, and they would have had to have accounted for it. Okay, they had no choice. They call this the final report on the collapse of the Twin Towers. Clearly, It should have been called the final report on the initiation of collapse, if anything. They say, in fact, in a response to our questions, we're unable to provide a full explanation of total collapse of the Twin Towers. We think so, too. After all, buildings are very difficult to destroy, as opposed to our eardrums. You can drop a building 8 stories, and it still won't be destroyed if the charges don't go off right. These buildings are inherently robust and over-designed. So lots of things go wrong when you try